Warning, these stories are not suitable for younger audiences. Subscribe before. Turn off the lights, get into bed, and plug in your earphones. It's time for a creepy bedtime story. For the discerning horror fan, we cover the most chilling cases from around the world. From the paranormal to the supernatural, unsolved mysteries and strange deaths, to cryptids, conspiracy theories, and the most disturbing of true crimes, all told in a unique and creepy way. Join channel Sleep with Scary Stories every day for a new scary story. Start story today. The Dark Entity Haunting the Philippine Islands, full documentary. Part 1. The Mysterious Woman Who Vanished. Amelia had always been a woman of grace and resilience. She lived in a modest home on the outskirts of Manila, surrounded by the noise and chaos of the bustling city. But inside, her life was anything but ordinary. She was married to Mark, a hard-working police officer, and together they had 2 beautiful children. Life was a constant struggle for Amelia. Despite Mark's unwavering dedication to his job, their finances barely stretched to cover the bare necessities. Each day she woke up knowing that her family's future was hanging by a thread, yet her love for them kept her going. She did what she could, from sewing clothes to taking on odd jobs around the neighborhood. But the weight of poverty was a heavy burden to bear, and the pressure of providing for her children was suffocating. Amelia spent many nights staring at empty cupboards, the silence of her home echoing her silent desperation. Every day was a battle between hope and hopelessness, between her love for her family and the grim reality of their situation. It was during one of those dark moments that the opportunity came, an offer to work overseas. For many Filipinos, this was a chance to break free from the chains of poverty, to send money back home and give their families a better life. It wasn't an easy decision. Amelia had never been away from her family before, but the thought of securing a future for her children was too powerful to ignore. She had heard the stories of those who had gone abroad, worked in foreign lands, and returned to the Philippines with enough money to build a house, send their children to school, and live a life free from the constant struggle. Amelia's heart ached as she said goodbye to her family, promising them that this was only temporary, that she would return soon with the money they desperately needed. But deep down, she knew that her departure would change everything. She boarded the plane to Kuwait, a land so foreign and distant from everything she knew, with hope in her heart and tears in her eyes. Her arrival in Kuwait was filled with expectations of a better life. She was to work as a domestic helper in a wealthy household, taking care of the home and the children. The pay was good, and she believed it was her way to secure a better future for her family. But the reality of her new life hit her like a cold slap. Her employers were cruel, and the work was grueling. She spent long hours cleaning, cooking, and caring for children who were not her own, only to be met with cold indifference and harsh treatment. The luxury of the home she worked in only made her feel more isolated, more trapped. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Amelia's hopes slowly withered as she endured not just the physical labor, but the emotional toll of being treated like an invisible servant. She confided in a fellow Filipino worker, a woman who had been in Kuwait longer. They would meet secretly, exchanging stories of the hardships they faced. Despite the abuse, Amelia tried to keep her head down, telling herself it was all for her children, just a temporary sacrifice. But what she didn't know was that fate had something much darker in store for her. One fateful night, as she walked home from a long day of work, she was attacked. A group of men, driven by a malicious hunger, assaulted her, leaving her battered and broken. The world went black as Amelia slipped into unconsciousness. Her body lay in a hospital bed, barely clinging to life. Her friend, the one person who had been there for her, came to visit, finding Amelia in a state of ruin. But in that moment, something changed. Her friend passed on to her something dark and powerful. Amelia had no idea what it was, but when she woke, the world felt different. Something inside her had shifted. She returned home to the Philippines weeks later, but the woman who stepped off the plane was not the same person who had left. Mark embraced her, but he felt a coldness in her touch. There was something hollow in her eyes, something unrecognizable. And though she returned to the life she once knew, Amelia was no longer the loving wife and mother. Now, you might be wondering, what happened to Amelia after that? How did a mother who had left her family with nothing but love and hope return as something else? Stay tuned, because the story is far from over and the truth is far darker than anyone could have imagined. If you're intrigued by Amelia's journey and want to know more about the terrifying twists that await, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more chilling tales. Your support keeps us going, and we promise there are more terrifying stories coming your way. Question for you: what do you think happened to Amelia after she returned to the Philippines? A. She was still the same loving mother and wife. B. She became something monstrous, unrecognizable. Comment your answer A or B below and let us know what you think. Part 2. The Dark Path to Kuwait. When Amelia arrived in Kuwait, she was filled with a mix of hope and uncertainty. The prospect of earning money for her family was a beacon in the dark, a chance to break free from the suffocating grip of poverty that had haunted her and her family for so long. She had been told that working abroad would be the key to a better life, that the sacrifices she made would be worth it in the end. But as she stepped off the plane, her heart heavy with both excitement and trepidation, Amelia could never have imagined the horrors that awaited her in this foreign land. She was welcomed into a lavish home by her employers, a wealthy family who lived in a spacious villa far removed from the poverty that she knew. The house was full of luxury and grandeur, a stark contrast to the modest home she had left behind. The elegance of the surroundings made Amelia feel even more like an outsider, a servant in a world she could never truly belong to. She had expected hard work, yes, but she hadn't expected to feel invisible, stripped of her humanity. The family treated her as little more than an extension of the furniture, something to be used and discarded without a second thought. Days turned into weeks, and Amelia found herself sinking deeper into a place of despair. The hours were long, and the tasks endless. She cleaned, cooked, and cared for the children of the household, always under the watchful eyes of her employers, who never once acknowledged the sacrifices she made. The wealth around her seemed like a cruel reminder of her own family's struggles. Amelia had hoped for a chance to change her life, but instead she felt more trapped than ever. Her dreams of providing a better future for her children slipped further away with each passing day. But it wasn't just the grueling work that wore her down. The abuse she endured from her employers was far more sinister. They were cold and indifferent, their treatment of her bordering on cruelty. There were days when Amelia would find herself crying silently in the kitchen, exhausted and emotionally drained, wondering if it was all worth it. She had become a ghost in that house, a figure who was always present but never truly seen. And yet, despite everything, Amelia kept going. She kept pushing herself, convincing herself that it was only temporary, that soon she would return home, her family's life transformed. One day, in the midst of her isolation, Amelia met Liza, another Filipino woman working in the same area. Liza had been in Kuwait for years and had become a close confidant for Amelia, someone she could talk to when the loneliness and the weight of the abuse became too much to bear. Their conversations, though brief, were a lifeline for Amelia. Liza shared stories of her own hardships and gave Amelia the strength to keep going, to endure just a little longer. But there was something in Liza's eyes, a hidden knowledge that made Amelia uneasy. There was a darkness in her friend's smile, a glimpse of something unsettling that Amelia couldn't quite place. As time wore on, the emotional toll of the abuse began to take its toll on Amelia. She began to feel like a shell of the woman she had once been. Her spirit, once strong and full of love for her family, was slowly being drained away by the harsh reality of her situation. But no matter how hard it got, she held on to one thought: the belief that she was doing this for her children. The hope that she would return home with enough money to change their lives kept her moving forward, even when every step felt heavier than the last. However, it was during one of those dark moments, as Amelia walked back to her employer's home after a grueling day of work, that her life would take a turn for the worse. She was cornered by a group of men. The attack was brutal and unexpected, their cruelty far beyond anything Amelia had ever experienced. They left her unconscious, broken and bruised, her body discarded like an empty vessel. She had been pushed to the edge, and now, it seemed, The world she had worked so hard to escape from had swallowed her whole. As Amelia lay in the hospital, drifting in and out of consciousness, the faint whisper of Liza echoed in her mind. Liza had visited her, and in her visit she did something that Amelia could never have anticipated. Liza passed on to her a gift, something dark and powerful, something that Amelia would come to regret. At the time, she didn't understand what had happened, but the changes that followed would soon make it painfully clear. Amelia recovered physically from the attack, but when she left the hospital and returned to her family in the Philippines, she was no longer the same woman. The scars from her assault were hidden, but the ones on the inside ran deeper than anyone could imagine. She came back to Mark, her husband, who had waited for her return with open arms. But when he saw her again, he immediately knew something was different. Amelia was still physically there, but the warmth, the love, everything that had made her who she was gone. The woman who returned from Kuwait was a shadow of the woman who had left. Something had been taken from her, and in its place something else had been left behind. What that something was, Mark couldn't understand, but the changes in Amelia were undeniable, and they would soon prove to be far more terrifying than he could ever have imagined. Part 3. The Tragedy That Changed Everything. Amelia's return to the Philippines was meant to be a reunion, a moment of relief and joy after months of suffering in a foreign land. Mark stood at the airport, waiting anxiously for her arrival, his heart pounding with the hope of seeing the woman he loved. When he finally laid eyes on her, he rushed forward, arms wide open. The embrace should have been a comfort, a symbol of their enduring love. But something was wrong. Amelia's touch was cold, distant, as though the warmth had drained out of her during her time abroad. As they made their way home to Cebu, Mark couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that gnawed at him. The woman who had once been his everything now seemed like a mere shell, her eyes hollow, her expression unreadable. The person he had eagerly awaited was no longer there. The trauma of the assault in Kuwait had done more than just harm her physically. It had shattered something deep within her soul. When they arrived at their modest home, Mark tried to settle into a semblance of normalcy. He asked about her time abroad, about the people she had met, the experiences she had endured. But Amelia's responses were flat, distant, as though she was speaking from a place far removed from her former self. She was there, but she wasn't truly present. She didn't laugh anymore, didn't engage in the small moments of affection they once shared. And worst of all, she no longer seemed to care for their children the way she once had. The bond that had tied her to them was visibly gone, replaced by a strange coldness that Mark could not understand. Days passed, and Mark's worry grew. The silence between them stretched further, and the familiar warmth of their home felt colder with each passing day. The children, sensing the shift in their mother, began to retreat into themselves. Amelia no longer smiled at them, no longer tucked them into bed with the same tenderness. She would sit for hours in a trance-like state, staring at nothing, lost in a world that Mark could not reach. It was during these long, lonely days that Mark began to see glimpses of something more disturbing. Sometimes he would catch her muttering under her breath, words that seemed foreign even to him. Other times she would smile, a thin, almost predatory smile that made his skin crawl. There were moments when she would stare at their children for far too long, a look in her eyes that sent a chill down his spine. Mark tried to ignore it, chalking it up to her trauma, but deep down he knew something was wrong. Something far worse than just emotional scars was at play. One evening, as Mark returned home from work, he was greeted by an unusual sight. Amelia was in the kitchen preparing dinner. The scent of cooked meat filled the air, and for a brief moment Mark thought he had caught a glimpse of the woman he had known. someone who cared enough to make a meal for her family. But as he stepped into the room, something felt off. There was an eerie stillness about her, a sense that she was watching him more than she was engaged in the task at hand. "Where are the children?" Mark asked, noticing their absence. It was strange. He had expected them to be at the table, ready for dinner. Amelia simply smiled, a crooked, unsettling grin that didn't reach her eyes. Without a word, she gestured toward the pot on the stove where the stew was still simmering. Mark, curious but unnerved, approached the pot, thinking perhaps it was just the smell that was making him feel uneasy. But when he looked inside, a sudden wave of horror crashed over him. The truth hit him like a freight train, so brutal and so unforgiving that it left him breathless. In that pot, amidst the stew, was something that had once been his children. Their bodies, his flesh and blood, now reduced to a twisted, unrecognizable form. His heart raced as nausea churned in his stomach. His world had just shattered. Amelia, his loving wife, had taken their children and turned them into a meal. His mind refused to process the reality before him, and in that instant the love he had for her crumbled into horror and disbelief. Mark screamed, the sound raw and guttural, as he grabbed a knife, the only thing he could find to fight against the nightmare unfolding in front of him. His hands shook, his breath erratic, but he could not stop himself. He lunged at Amelia, rage and grief consuming him, the desire to destroy this monster in front of him outweighing everything else. In the struggle that ensued, the knife slashed at Amelia's face, leaving a long, deep wound across her cheek. But to his shock, she didn't falter. The blood poured from her face, but she didn't seem to care. Instead, she escaped from his grasp, disappearing into the night, leaving Mark standing there, broken and empty. Mark never saw her again. Amelia, or whatever she had become, vanished into the shadows, leaving behind only the haunting memory of the woman she once was. The days that followed were filled with confusion and terror. Mark tried to explain to the authorities what had happened, but no one believed him. Amelia became a legend, a tale of horror whispered in the dark corners of Cebu, a story of a mother turned monster. They called her Mar Labo, named after the scar that marked her face. But Mark knew better. He knew that the woman he had once loved was gone, replaced by something far more terrifying, something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Part 4. A return that wasn't the same. Amelia's return to the Philippines was meant to be a reunion, a moment of relief and joy after months of suffering in a foreign land. Mark stood at the airport, waiting anxiously for her arrival, his heart pounding with the hope of seeing the woman he loved. When he finally laid eyes on her, he rushed forward, arms wide open. The embrace should have been a comfort, a symbol of their enduring love. But something was wrong. Amelia's touch was cold, distant, as though the warmth had drained out of her during her time abroad. As they made their way home to Cebu, Mark couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that gnawed at him. The woman who had once been his everything now seemed like a mere shell, her eyes hollow, her expression unreadable. The person he had eagerly awaited was no longer there. The trauma of the assault in Kuwait had done more than just harm her physically. It had shattered something deep within her soul. When they arrived at their modest home, Mark tried to settle into a semblance of normalcy. He asked about her time abroad, about the people she had met, the experiences she had endured. But Amelia's responses were flat, distant, as though she was speaking from a place far removed from her former self. She was there, but she wasn't truly present. She didn't laugh anymore, didn't engage in the small moments of affection they once shared. And worst of all, she no longer seemed to care for their children the way she once had. The bond that had tied her to them was visibly gone, replaced by a strange coldness that Mark could not understand. Days passed, and Mark's worry grew. The silence between them stretched further, and the familiar warmth of their home felt colder with each passing day. The children, sensing the shift in their mother, began to retreat into themselves. Amelia no longer smiled at them, no longer tucked them into bed with the same tenderness. She would sit for hours in a trance-like state, staring at nothing, lost in a world that Mark could not reach. It was during these long, lonely days that Mark began to see glimpses of something more disturbing. Sometimes he would catch her muttering under her breath words that seemed foreign even to him. Other times she would smile, a thin, almost predatory smile that made his skin crawl. There were moments when she would stare at their children for far too long, a look in her eyes that sent a chill down his spine. Mark tried to ignore it, chalking it up to her trauma, but deep down he knew something was wrong. Something far worse than just emotional scars was at play. One evening, as Mark returned home from work, he was greeted by an unusual sight. Amelia was in the kitchen preparing dinner. The scent of cooked meat filled the air, and for a brief moment Mark thought he had caught a glimpse of the woman he had known, someone who cared enough to make a meal for her family. But as he stepped into the room, something felt off. There was an eerie stillness about her, a sense that she was watching him more than she was engaged in the task at hand. "Where are the children?" Mark asked, noticing their absence. It was strange. He had expected them to be at the table, ready for dinner. Amelia simply smiled, a crooked, unsettling grin that didn't reach her eyes. Without a word, she gestured toward the pot on the stove, where the stew was still simmering. Mark, curious but unnerved, approached the pot, thinking perhaps it was just the smell that was making him feel uneasy. But when he looked inside, a sudden wave of horror crashed over him. The truth hit him like a freight train, so brutal and so unforgiving that it left him breathless. In that pot, amidst the stew, was something that had once been his children, their bodies, his flesh and blood, now reduced to a twisted, unrecognizable form. His heart raced as nausea churned in his stomach. His world had just shattered. Amelia, his loving wife, had taken their children and turned them into a meal. His mind refused to process the reality before him, and in that instant, the love he had for her crumbled into horror and disbelief. Mark screamed, the sound raw and guttural, as he grabbed a knife, the only thing he could find to fight against the nightmare unfolding in front of him. His hands shook, his breath erratic, but he could not stop himself. He lunged at Amelia, rage and grief consuming him, the desire to destroy this monster in front of him outweighing everything else. In the struggle that ensued, the knife slashed at Amelia's face, leaving a long, deep wound across her cheek. But to his shock, she didn't falter. The blood poured from her face, but she didn't seem to care. Instead, she escaped from his grasp, disappearing into the night, leaving Mark standing there, broken and empty. Mark never saw her again. Amelia, or whatever she had become, vanished into the shadows, leaving behind only the haunting memory of the woman she once was. The days that followed were filled with confusion and terror. Mark tried to explain to the authorities what had happened, but no one believed him. Amelia became a legend, a tale of horror whispered in the dark corners of Cebu, a story of a mother-turned-monster. They called her Mar Labo, named after the scar that marked her face. But Mark knew better. He knew that the woman he had once loved was gone, replaced by something far more terrifying, something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Part 5. The Unthinkable Dinner. Mark had never imagined that his life would unravel so violently, so tragically. The moment Amelia had disappeared into the night, everything he thought he knew about the world, about his family, had been destroyed. It was impossible for him to even process the reality that his wife, the woman he had spent years building a life with, had become something monstrous. She had murdered their children, turned them into a grotesque meal, and then vanished. What remained in the wake of this nightmare was the crushing emptiness of a life he could no longer recognize. The days after her disappearance were filled with nothing but darkness. Mark's mind was a blur of grief, rage, and disbelief. He couldn't make sense of what had happened. Every time he closed his eyes, he could see the image of his children's bodies. The horrifying truth about the meal that had been served before him burned into his memory. He felt as though he were trapped in an endless nightmare, one from which he could not wake. Despite his search, there was no sign of Amelia. The authorities were of little help, their disinterest or disbelief in his story only deepening his isolation. They called it a tragedy, a story of a woman gone mad, but Mark knew better. He knew that this was no ordinary loss. His wife had been consumed by something far darker, something that had twisted her into the thing she had become. And yet, no one believed him. They didn't understand. Mark's grief soon turned to something more dangerous: obsession. He couldn't stop thinking about her, about what she had become. He would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she was still out there somewhere, lurking in the shadows. He replayed every moment of their life together, searching for any sign, any hint that could explain how this had happened. But all he found were memories of a life that was no longer his. Amelia was gone. The village began to talk. Whispers of the Marlabo, the woman with the grotesque scar, spread like wildfire. People spoke in hushed tones about her, about what she had done. Some claimed to have seen her, others said they had heard strange noises at night, the sound of something watching from the darkness. Mark couldn't escape the growing legend of his wife. It was as if she had become a specter, haunting the very place she had once called home. And so Amelia became something more than just a memory. She became a figure in the village's folklore, a terrifying tale that parents told their children to keep them in line. She was no longer the woman he had married. She had transcended into something much darker. The monster in the shadows, the woman who had once been the heart of his family, was now an embodiment of fear, a figure that would linger long after her body had vanished. Mark, now living in the cold, empty house they had once shared, found no solace in the days that passed. The pain never faded. The unanswered questions gnawed at him, eating away at the remnants of his sanity. Was Amelia still out there, stalking the streets at night? Had she become something worse, something even more unrecognizable? The idea haunted him like a shadow, never leaving him, and with it, the unbearable weight of a love lost forever. And still, the village waited for something. The legend of the woman who had vanished, the monster who had killed her children, hung heavy in the air. Mark waited too, not for answers, but for the terrible possibility that someday, somehow, Amelia would return. Not as the wife he had loved, but as the monster she had become. Part 6. The Chase and the Vanishing. In the weeks that followed Amelia's disappearance, Mark's obsession with the truth only deepened. The gaping hole left in his life, his children gone, his wife transformed into something monstrous, could not be filled. Every corner of the house seemed to echo with the remnants of the life they had once shared, yet it was a life that no longer made sense. His mind, once sharp and clear, was now clouded by the search for answers. Had Amelia truly disappeared, or was she still out there, hiding in the shadows, watching him? He began asking questions, questioning the people in their neighborhood, desperate for even the smallest hint that might explain what had happened. But the responses he received were always vague, disjointed, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of ignorance. Some whispered of strange sightings, of a woman with a gnarled scar running down her face, appearing only at night. Others claimed they had heard distant cries, eerie sounds that seemed to come from nowhere, from everywhere. But there was no solid evidence. There were only stories, rumors, and fear. Mark couldn't stop himself. He had to know. He had to find her, even if it meant descending into madness. His days were consumed by the search, walking through the darkened streets of Cebu, visiting places he never thought he would go. He scoured the woods outside the town, places where no one dared to wander after dark, convinced that Amelia was out there, somewhere. His search turned into an obsession, an unhealthy fixation that left him sleepless, eating little, and losing the will to care about anything other than finding the woman who had once been his wife. The locals avoided him, sensing the madness in his eyes. They didn't understand what had happened, nor did they want to. But there were those who seemed to know more, those who didn't speak openly but offered cryptic warnings. One elderly woman, her face wrinkled with age and experience, told him one evening that the monster he sought was not just a product of madness. She said that in the hills beyond the town, where the trees grew thick and the shadows seemed alive, there were whispers of an entity that walked like a human but was far from it. She spoke of the Aswang, a creature from the depths of Filipino folklore, known for its ability to take on the form of loved ones, to prey upon the innocent, and to feast on flesh and blood. "Your wife," the woman said softly, her eyes never leaving his, "is not the woman you once knew. She has become something else, something worse." The words hung in the air, thick with the weight of their truth. Mark was shaken, but he couldn't turn back now. The desperation to understand consumed him. Amelia's disappearance, her monstrous actions, had transformed her into something beyond his comprehension. She was no longer just a woman. She had become part of the legend, part of something darker than any rational mind could grasp. Mark continued his search, following the faintest of clues, each one leading him deeper into the heart of darkness. He had crossed a line, one that could not be undone. The stories of the Aswang, once just eerie tales told around a campfire, now felt painfully real. He was no longer looking for his wife. He was looking for something that might never be found, and deep down he began to wonder if he ever truly wanted to find it at all. As Mark wandered further into the unknown, he felt the grip of fear tightening around him. The more he searched, the more the shadows seemed to close in, and for the first time since Amelia's disappearance, he began to question whether she was still out there, waiting for him, waiting to finish what she had started. Part 7. The Legend of the Aswang. Mark's journey into the unknown, chasing the shadow of his lost wife, began to blur the line between reality and nightmare. The more he delved into the local folklore, the more he came to realize that Amelia's transformation was not just the result of trauma, but something far more sinister, something that had been woven into the fabric of the Philippines for centuries. The Aswang, a shape-shifting creature of legend, was no mere story to scare children. It was a malevolent force that had been part of the culture long before Amelia had ever left for Kuwait. He began to hear whispers of this creature, stories passed down from the elders who spoke of its insatiable hunger for human flesh, its ability to take on the form of anyone at all, to lure its victims into the dark. The more Mark learned, the more he saw the undeniable parallels between Amelia and the description of the Aswang. Her transformation was not just physical, it was something deep within her soul. She had become something else entirely, something beyond the woman he had married. The Aswang was said to live among the people, walking as one of them during the day, blending seamlessly into society. But when night fell, its true nature emerged, a creature driven by an unholy hunger. Some say it could transform into a dog, a pig, or even a bird, stalking the streets in search of its next meal. Others whispered of the Aswang's ability to mimic loved ones, to take on the shape of a wife, a mother, a friend, and use that trust to gain entry into homes and prey upon the unsuspecting. It was a predator, pure and simple, one that fed on the flesh and blood of its victims, often children or pregnant women. But there was more to it. The Aswang was also a symbol of darkness, a manifestation of evil that could infect anyone, passing on its curse like a deadly inheritance. Mark's thoughts became consumed with the idea that Amelia had become one of these creatures. He could no longer deny the truth he had been so desperately trying to avoid. Amelia was no longer his wife. She had become a monster, a being of pure hunger, and she was still out there, lurking in the shadows. He could almost hear her voice in his mind, her soft whispers, her cryptic smiles. The woman who had once cooked for him, who had nurtured their children, was now gone, replaced by something darker. He could no longer recognize her in the same way. The woman who had returned to him was no longer someone who could be reasoned with. She had lost the humanity he had clung to so fiercely. What remained was a vessel for something monstrous, something that hungered for destruction and death. As he wandered deeper into the night, Mark felt the weight of his search pressing against him. Every step forward was one toward the unknown, toward a truth he wasn't sure he wanted to face. The village had already begun to speak of her in hushed tones, calling her Mar Labo, a name that had become synonymous with the horror she had unleashed. The scar across her face, the mark of her monstrous transformation, had made her a figure of terror. But for Mark, the name carried no comfort, no sense of closure. It was just another reminder of the horror he could not escape. Mark began to question everything. Had Emilia always been doomed to this fate? Had there been something in her all along, a darkness that only needed a trigger to emerge? Or had the violence she endured in Kuwait truly been the turning point, the catalyst that had awakened the monster within her? He had no answers, only endless questions that gnawed at him, eroding his mind with each passing day. The more Mark searched, the more it became clear the Aswang was not just a myth, it was real, and it was hunting him. Part 8. The Enduring Curse and the Legacy of the Aswang. As the days passed, the weight of Emilia's transformation became a suffocating presence in Mark's life. What had once been a love, pure and unshakable, had turned into a nightmarish memory that haunted him every moment of every day. Her disappearance was not the end. It was only the beginning of something darker, something that Mark had never truly understood. The more he searched for answers, the deeper he sank into a world of fear, despair, and uncertainty. The once familiar landscape of his life had been overtaken by a creeping darkness, one that he could neither escape nor fully comprehend. Mark had come to realize that Emilia's curse was not just hers alone. It was a part of something ancient, something woven into the very fabric of Filipino folklore, the Aswang. The creature, a shape-shifting monster, was said to be driven by an insatiable hunger, one that could never be quenched. It could walk among the people, disguised as a loved one, only to prey on the innocent when night fell. Emilia had become one of them, a living nightmare that once wore the face of the woman he had adored. The Aswang had consumed her, replacing the woman he knew with a predator, a creature of pure malevolence. The more Mark thought about it, the more he understood that the Aswang was not just a monster of flesh. It was a manifestation of something darker, something deep within the human psyche. It was the evil that lurked in the corners of the world, a creature born of fear, pain, and suffering. And now, Emilia was a part of that evil. She had become the embodiment of everything that was wrong in the world, an endless cycle of death and destruction. Mark found himself trapped in a torment of his own making, unable to let go of the past, unable to accept what Emilia had become. He continued his search, despite knowing deep down that he may never find her, that he would never get the answers he so desperately craved. But in the end, he realized that the search wasn't for closure. It was for the chance to face the monster, to confront the horror that had taken his wife, his family, and his life. As time wore on, Mark began to understand the deeper truth. There would be no return from this. Emilia was gone, and in her place was something far worse, something that could never be redeemed. The legend of the Aswang had become his reality, and now Mark was left to live in the shadow of a creature that was once his love. The darkness would never leave him because in the end he had become part of the story, part of the curse that would haunt the village for generations to come. As we reach the end of Amelia's tragic and chilling story, it's hard not to feel the weight of the emotions that have been stirred. What began as a tale of hope and sacrifice quickly descended into a nightmare, leaving behind the haunting question, how far can trauma push the human spirit before it transforms into something unrecognizable? Amelia's journey is a stark reminder of the fragility of the human mind and the darkness that can arise when we are pushed to our limits. At its core, this story teaches us the profound impact that trauma, abuse, and isolation can have on a person. Amelia's descent into becoming the Aswang, a creature born from fear and suffering, is a reflection of the invisible scars that are often left on those who endure unthinkable pain. It's a reminder that while we may see the physical wounds of a person, the psychological scars often go unnoticed, festering and growing in silence until they become too much to bear. Amelia's story is a tragic warning about the importance of mental health, compassion, and the need to reach out to those who are suffering before it's too late. But beyond the terror, there is also an important lesson about strength. Mark's endless search for Amelia, despite knowing the truth, reveals a profound love and determination that refuses to be extinguished. His search may have led him into the dark corners of his own mind, but it also shows us the resilience of the human spirit, the desperate will to find closure, even when confronted by an overwhelming darkness. The story of Amelia and Mark is one that echoes long after the final word. It reminds us that our deepest fears are often born from our own unresolved pain, and that the monsters we face are sometimes born of our own making. But it also encourages us to face those fears head-on, to seek help when needed, and to remember that no one should face their darkest moments alone. If you found this story haunting and thought-provoking, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue creating more stories that not only entertain but also inspire. Stay with us, as there are many more chilling tales and life lessons yet to be shared. Thank you for being a part of this journey. Together, we explore the darkest corners of our world and the lessons they hold.